In the entire history of the world, no nation has ever done what Britain did in the 19th century. They took the most powerful navy ever assembled and used it to wage war against an institution that had existed for thousands of years. They weren't conquering territory. They weren't stealing resources. They were hunting slave traders. And they were willing to fight anyone, anywhere, to stop them. Britain confronted over 50 African kingdoms and Arab sultanates. They captured 1,600 slave ships. They freed 150,000 enslaved people. They bombarded slave fortresses into rubble. They burned slave markets that had operated for centuries. They told sultans and kings the same message: end the slave trade, or we will end you. This is the story of the Royal Navy's war on slavery, a crusade that cost Britain 2% of its entire national budget every year. A campaign that killed 1 in 5 British sailors who served in it. A military operation that changed the world. Let me show you what really happened when Britain decided that slavery had to end, no matter the cost. After Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, they faced a massive problem. Other nations continued trading. Arab merchants had been running slave operations for 1,000 years. African kingdoms profited from selling captives. European competitors ignored the ban. Britain's answer was unprecedented: enforce abolition globally with military force. In 1808, they created the West Africa Squadron, dedicating 1/6 of the entire Royal Navy to hunting slavers. But they didn't just chase ships at sea. They took the fight to land, attacking slave markets and fortresses directly. The West Africa Squadron patrolled 3,000 miles of African coast. Over 50 years, they captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 people. When British sailors caught a slave ship, they'd free the captives, burn the vessel, and arrest the crew. But Britain realized they were treating symptoms, not the disease. They needed to destroy the source: the slave fortresses, the markets, the kingdoms that supplied the trade. Britain began attacking the infrastructure of slavery itself. They targeted slave fortresses along the coast, massive stone structures that had operated for centuries. British warships would sail into ports, demand the release of captives, and if refused, bombard the fortifications into rubble. Slave pens burned. Markets were destroyed. Local rulers received ultimatums: sign a treaty ending slavery or face continued bombardment. Between 1820 and 1860, Britain forced over 50 African chiefs and kings to sign anti-slavery treaties. These weren't friendly negotiations. These were agreements made at gunpoint. In 1840 alone, dozens of treaties were signed along the West African coast. The Kingdom of Lagos in Nigeria was a major slave hub. When the king refused British demands, the Royal Navy bombarded Lagos in 1851. When the trade resumed, Britain returned in 1861 and annexed Lagos entirely. The slave trade ended immediately. The most dramatic confrontation happened in Zanzibar. For over 1,000 years, Arab merchants had run a massive slave trade from East Africa to the Middle East. Zanzibar was the epicenter. The Sultan of Zanzibar controlled a network enslaving hundreds of thousands from the African interior. Britain negotiated treaties in 1822 and 1845. The Sultan ignored both. The Arab slave traders were powerful, wealthy, and saw no reason to stop. In 1873, Britain sent a final message. The British consul John Kirk delivered an ultimatum to Sultan Bargash bin Said: close the slave markets permanently or face the Royal Navy. The Sultan hesitated. Kirk was blunt. British warships were already coming. They would blockade Zanzibar. They would bombard the palace. End slavery now or lose everything. On June 5, 1873, facing imminent British warships, Sultan Bargash surrendered. He signed a decree closing all slave markets in his territories. The great slave market of Zanzibar, operating for centuries, shut down. Today, an Anglican cathedral stands on that exact spot, deliberately built on the former slave market as a symbol of its end. Britain pushed deeper into Africa, targeting slave routes bringing captives from the interior. They established patrols on major rivers, built forts to cut off trade routes, and supported African groups fighting slave raiders. The human cost was staggering. 1 in 5 British sailors serving in the West Africa Squadron died, mostly from malaria and yellow fever. The West African coast became known as the white man's grave. Yet volunteers kept signing up for the moral cause. The financial cost was equally enormous. Britain spent 2% of its entire national budget every year on anti-slavery operations. Over decades, hundreds of millions of pounds. Britain spent more fighting slavery than on most other government functions combined. By the 1880s, Britain had succeeded. The transatlantic slave trade was dead. The Arab slave trade in East Africa was crushed. Slave markets across 2 continents were closed. Treaties with over 50 African and Arab rulers were enforced by British military power. This wasn't peaceful. This wasn't gradual moral enlightenment. This was Britain using overwhelming force to end practices that had existed for centuries. And yes, while Britain fought slavery, they were also building a colonial empire. The same navy that freed slaves also enforced British control. The motivations were mixed, the methods were aggressive, and the legacy remains complicated. But the results are undeniable. Britain freed 150,000 people directly. They forced the closure of countless slave markets. They confronted kings, sultans, and emperors. They spent a fortune and sacrificed thousands of lives. A practice that had existed for millennia was destroyed within a few generations, not through persuasion alone, but through the systematic use of military power against anyone who continued the trade. Britain took on 50 nations. They told sultans and kings that slavery would end or they would face destruction, and they followed through. Standing in that cathedral in Zanzibar, built where slaves were once sold, or reading those treaties signed under threat of bombardment, or looking at records of 1,600 captured ships and 150,000 freed people, one thing is absolutely clear. When much of the world was content to profit from human misery, Britain took action. They sent their navy to the most dangerous coasts on Earth. They paid an enormous price in money and lives, and they changed the world. Yet today, in the same North African sands where Arab traders once loaded captives, the chains have not fully broken. In Libya, migrants from across the continent are kidnapped, auctioned in open markets, sold for labor or worse modern slave auctions, captured on video, documented by the UN and NGOs as recently as 2025. In Mauritania, hereditary slavery lingers, with people born into bondage, inherited like property despite new courts and laws. Recent UN reports from 2025 to 2026 describe migrants in Libyan detention facing routine slavery-like abuses. Forced labor, torture, sexual violence, and commodification in a violent business model that's become normalized. In Mauritania, the 2025 U.S. Trafficking in Persons Report notes the government identified hereditary slavery victims for the first time in years. Yet prosecutions remain rare, and descent-based bondage persists among Haratine communities, with people still treated as inheritable property in herding and domestic work. Slavery didn't vanish in the 19th century, it simply changed its face, and ending it for good still demands the same raw, unrelenting courage Britain once showed.